Welcome to Moments with Marianne. I'm so delighted we're spending this time here today. We have a very special guest coming right up. Our guest today is Christina Nichol, and she's here to share with us her new book, Waiting for the Electricity. Now, Christina grew up in Northern California and received her degree from the University of Florida. She has traveled widely, worked for nonprofit film companies, and taught English all over the world. Christina's debut novel, Waiting for the Electricity, has won numerous awards, including the 2015 California Book Awards for First Fiction. She's been published in many publications, including Lucky Peach, The Paris Review, Harper's, Subtropics, Lonely Planet, and The Wall Street Journal. So let's welcome to the show, Christina.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
It's such a pleasure to have you here. My goodness, your book, Waiting for the Electricity, is just, people are just raving about it.
Yeah, people, especially who are interested in Georgia.
Yeah, they're giving it some really pretty good reviews there. Well, and so I've got to ask you, so what was the main inspiration behind this book? And I know it's kind of a little bit of a long story, but we've got time.
So I had lived in Georgia for about a year and a half, and
that's the Republic of Georgia. Yeah.
This is the Republic of Georgia, which is located on the Black Sea, right above Turkey, It was a kind of culture that the values of America would sort of think doesn't really exist, because the bottom line is not materialism. The bottom line is singing and dancing and poetry and creativity and feasting, and it was. Right, it was about 10 years after the Soviet collapse, and so they were sort of recreating their identity, and so they were looking for examples of cultures that they resonated with, because they didn't really resonate with American culture. And so they thought, okay, well, now we have this chance to become who we want to be, because now we're away from the yoke of the Soviet Union. And so they looked toward the 12th century, and so they saw that as this chivalric time. And so the young men at that time were had what was called this Robin Hood complex, where they would, hold up trains and steal from the men and give to the women. And so it was this incredibly romantic time. It was also a dangerous time, because there was very little money, and so there were a lot of other kind of bandits around, but yet there was this kind of Don Quixote-like comedic quality. And so living there, I was always wondering, is this for real? Can a country sustain itself like this? And the sort of the rhythms of comedy sort of entered my soul, so that and they use comedy as a way of kind of turning their suffering upside down, of sort of reestablishing power dynamics. And so comedy was one way of doing that. And so I came back to the U.S. and underwent a kind of extreme culture shock, because the U.S. is much more, a rule-following kind of a culture. We, stop at stoplights. Things, as long as we sort of obey the rules, things function. Whereas I had just come from a place where they didn't believe in external rules. They had this romantic idea of following the rules of the heart. And so I came back, and I had this voice in my head of this Georgian man who was just constantly on my shoulder, making these comments about about America, about, you don't have natural tomatoes or, and so I couldn't really get him out of my head. And so I had this phrase come to me, my name is Slims Ahmed and I live in the 12th century. And so then he just kind of wrote the book, and I was living with a roommate at the time who would put an extra plate on the table for my main character and say, "Oh, how's Slim's doing today?" And I'd say, "Oh, he's kind of having a hard time. He's having a rough time in the U.S." And he at one point called his mom and said, "We have this new roommate. He's from Georgia. He's having a hard time." And his mom said, "Oh, well, I'll have my prayer group pray for him." So, he really, and his life actually improved after that. So he really became this sort of living, breathing person. At one point, he wanted to go to Florida, and I had never been to Florida, and I was like, why? What's in Florida? And he's like, "Oh, I've heard about these wet T-shirt contests." I had no interest in going to Florida, but then I ended up somehow going to graduate school there, and I sort of feel like he pulled me there somehow. So, yeah, he definitely was a kind of embodiment in my life.
Well, and it's such an interesting culture to come from, where people, or it is kind of that Robin Hood romantic, kind of crazy adventure,
Yeah. It's, if you have seen any Georgian dancing, it's this, they believe that they can, they're landlocked by all of these other countries who have attacked them for thousands of years. And, the Tbilisi's been demolished like 40 times, and their capital. And so they would often, scare their enemies by the vigor of their dancing. So they said, well, we don't really have guns, but we can scare away our enemies with our dances.
Well, and you'd look at that going, really? The dance right. Is scary? Right. But hey, French Polynesians, they do have war dances as well, So
right,
you look at these different kind of groups, and you're like, okay, well, that's kind of interesting. Well, and what just a fascinating difference. So, what were like some of the main differences that you noticed from like the Republic of Georgia to California? Because they sound like they're just vast.
Well, both regions are very fond of their wine, but Georgians, in California, it's all about sipping wine and in this, very detailed way. My brother has a restaurant, and every Monday morning he has these sommelier trainings, and so he talks about how they will say, "Oh, this tastes of, roasted almond peel and huckleberry magic marker." And the Georgians, they don't taste in that way, but they, just by smelling the wine, they know what region it comes from, which family it comes from. But their idea is that you don't ever drink wine individually. It's a ritualized experience. So they would have these 3-day-long feasts where you have basically actually layers of food, so 3 layers of food on top of each other, because this feast will last for 3 days. And it's because you make toasts for 3 days, and so each person will sit around the table, and there'll be a toastmaster, and he has to drink with everyone as they toast. You only have to drink if you make your own toast, but so he's eating butter and bread beforehand so he doesn't pass out, basically. Mm-hmm. So the first toast is always to peace, or to our countries, or to friendship, or to women. And then gradually, as the hours go by, it becomes to a toast to every single person at the table. So it would be a toast to you, and it would go around the table of 20 people saying everything that they love about you. And so each person would, for 20 minutes, talk about all of your good qualities. And I think that this, in some ways, is a kind of psychotherapy. It's a kind of communal psychotherapy. So no one really needs individual psychotherapy, whereas I think in California we're very into our individual spiritual evolvement, whereas in Georgia it's a much more communal experience. And I think part of that comes from the hardships that they went through. I mean, when I was there, Georgia used to be one of the richest republics of the Soviet Union because they were the warmest, and so they had all the roses and all the citrus, and they provided that to the rest of the regions. But after the Soviet collapse, they lost all their electricity, they lost all of their infrastructure. I mean, they were a developed country, and all of a sudden they became a third world country. And so they helped each other in a way I'd never experienced before. I mean, they really lived the golden rule of treating everyone like their brothers and sisters. And I mean, at one point, a friend of mine asked, well, in American churches, what do they talk about? And I said, well, you should be kind to your neighbor. She said, what? You talk about that? Isn't that obvious? And so I sort of felt like a kindergartner of like, oh, these are really evolved people. Like they really put their neighbors first. And so I wondered, what would happen in the U.S. if, we experienced the same level of tragedy as Georgia had, and, how would we help each other, or would we just care about our own? And so recently we had these fires in Northern California, and they came, I know many friends who lost their houses, and it's actually amazing to see is that I actually felt that quality that I had felt in Georgia here, in that there's something that happens where the kind of better parts of ourselves rise. And even since then, I mean, just a few months have passed, but the quality of interaction has subtly shifted. And I mean, I've traveled all around. I lived in many, many different countries, but after these fires, I sort of don't want to leave California because I see this quality emerging that I had so loved about Georgia, and so that's really hopeful.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it sounds, just so seeped in community in Georgia, and
yeah.
And you do kind of see that when there's disasters that happen in different parts of the country where people do come together to help one another, kind of like when we had the floodings in Texas.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
Well, and so I wanted to chat with you a little bit too about your writing process. So like how long did it take you to just do your research and do your work for Waiting for the Electricity?
Well, I was there in 2000 to 2002, which was right before they had this, what they call the Rose Revolution. And, I sort of worked on it for a while when I returned, but it was basically this story about these people who were just sitting around waiting for the electricity. It's not high action. And, but it was about sort of, in some ways, the grace that arises when you are surrendering to that moment of waiting. And I mean, in some ways, we've kind of lost that ability to wait and to see what arises. But it was sort of like, well, what happens then? I mean, you can't really write a novel about people who are just waiting. But then I went back in 2007, and they had gotten electricity finally, and noticing how that had changed the culture, how they were actually becoming more individualistic, and now they didn't just show up at each other's houses. They were, becoming more global citizens, and so then I sort of saw how I could end it. So then I took it up again. So there had been like a 5-year rest, but then I sort of figured out how I could end it. But it would I mean, when you're writing about another culture, it's sort of entering another space, and so every time I would leave the page, I would sort of come back to the U.S., and so it was going through a series of culture shocks.
I could imagine. Well, and so when you were doing your writing, was it like every day? Is there like a certain ritual that you do for your writing process, or you just sit down and it flows?
Well, I'm the last year I've been teaching, and I noticed that it's really, really hard to teach and write at the same time because they both use these creative output. And so for the last year, actually, I haven't written much. I'm working on a novel about South Korea right now, but I just sort of put it aside because I've been teaching. But this semester, I decided, okay, I can't put it aside anymore, and so I just made a commitment to myself. Okay, I'm going to work on this, and at least an hour a day. Preferably, I mean, I wake up really, really early. I wake up around 4, and so that is the best time I've found. And it is amazing how that was really all that it took. I mean, I thought that I had no more hours in the day, that it would be impossible, but just making that commitment, okay, I'm going to spend an hour a day, I've been able to keep it. So that's been amazing to me.
Well, your book is just, I mean, it's funny, and that's what everyone's talking about, just how well written it is and what a delightfully funny book it is. And there's your main character, his name is Slims. What are some of you kind of talked about a little bit about the voice and kind of showing up in your head. Was there any other inspiration that showed up that created this character?
Well, it was actually loosely based on a Georgian friend of mine who was a maritime lawyer who ended up going to New Orleans and becoming a total Republican. And so I sort of imagined, well, what if he had gone to San Francisco? Would he have had a different experience? And so it kind of came from that of this Georgian coming to San Francisco in the midst of the .com bubble. And it's funny because I had totally lost touch with him, and then just recently we got in touch, and I said, I just wrote this novel that was kind of based on you, and I sent it to him, and I was actually kind of nervous about what his response was going to be, and he wrote back, and it was like, oh yeah, this is where this voice came from. I could read you part of his email.
Oh yeah.
He said, it brings back so many feelings from the past, and he asks me to send it to the lawyer who he worked for, because he says, after Katrina, his fate became dramatic, and you can Google what happened to him. He lost everything and lives now on welfare in a tiny room in a crappy neighborhood. Unfortunately, I can't help him much, but I thought if he would have received from the author a book about the Georgian maritime lawyer, the old man would be delighted that he could somehow make his lonely living better. But then he writes, briefly about developments, you may know that Mr. Trump, with his business administration, was in Batumi a few years ago to build Trump Tower, and I happened to be there and shook hands with those folks. Then for some reason I haven't washed the right hand to keep virgin soul warmness, using mostly the left one for non-disclosing personal needs until I had to wash both, following our constitutional hygiene amendments, enacting democratic equal treatment for all big and small body parts. So you get a sense of this sort of voice, of this sort of constant irony.
Yeah. And it does add a little, from an American standpoint, there is a little bit of humor that's involved in the discussion as well, just in how he relates things.
Right. The way that this sort of globalized English, which I sort of delight in, and how people express themselves in English when it's not their first language, and that often it can sound more sincere. And so he's part of the novel is writing these letters to Hillary Clinton. She was Department of the State at the time, and so there was this idea that, oh well, this person who has all this power, because it's all about who your connections are in Georgia. It was like, well, if I could be friends with Hillary Clinton, then, it will, she can help us, our country. And so this earnestness that is hard to see these days of because we're such a cynical culture these days, but this sense of like, oh, well, if she just knew our problems, then she would really give us a help up. And so these kind of hapless, earnest yearnings to say, hey, we've shooken the yoke off of the Soviet Union. Now we're becoming like you. Don't you want to help us? And they all did have a kind of shock that, the Georgians felt shocked that we didn't help them more. That, they're like, well, we're like you. We're a cowboy culture like your culture. We're romantic. Don't you want to give us a hand? And they sort of felt a little bit rebuffed that we hadn't helped them more.
Mm-hmm. Well, and it's interesting just how the different cultures are, looking at the situation and just how that all comes, kind of comes into being, and especially within your book, it all kind of comes together. What were some of? It must have been, I think, kind of a little bit different writing in the voice of a man as you're doing that as a woman.
Yeah, originally I had gone back and forth between a male voice and then the voice of his sister, but it ended up being too long. It was like 800 pages, and my editor said, no, I think you have to drop her voice. And so I integrated her voice into his voice, and so it was almost like kind of combining the male and the female. And thus I sort of, it was an exercise in combining the male and the female in my own self, which was an interesting experience because I found that it was actually helpful in sort of evening out my own emotions of sort of having a way of doing that. And because he has this sort of comedic way of looking at the world, and so it was a kind of release in a sense of a when things got difficult, I could take on this other perspective, which what provided some release of that internal tension.
Mm-hmm. That makes perfect sense. My goodness, and your book is so well written; it just flows. And I love how your writing style and how you've written the book, and also how you channeled Slims. because it all comes together beautifully. What final thoughts would you like to leave our listeners with about your book? I know we haven't covered it too much because it's a novel. People, they need to pick up their own copy of Waiting for the Electricity. But what would you like to share with our listeners?
Well, I mean, it's really a novel that I recently read this book by Amitav Ghosh, who wrote this book called The Great Derangement, and it's talking about our current age and how in the future we're going to look back and be sort of shocked that we didn't deal with climate change a little sooner. And he correlates the modern novel to the carbon economy, and he says the carbon economy is about individual consumption, and the modern novel is about the individual moral adventure, and that the new narrative has to be more about the collective story. And so I think that in some ways this novel, since it's trying to be a little bit, it's definitely an individual moral adventure, but it's also trying to touch upon this collective story. And the collective story often is a more comedic story because it's digested discomfort in some ways. And so I think when people approach and read it in that way, it's very satisfying. If they're reading it just for, what's going to happen to this character, then it's less satisfying than trying to see sort of the comedy of what our current universal life is as a global culture, and sort of what's happening and other ways to look at it outside of the kind of American way.
Yeah. That. Well, Christina, thank you so much for taking the time to share your insights and your writing methods with us, and of course your book, Waiting for the Electricity. It's been such a joy to talk with you about your book.
Thank you so much. It was great to talk about it.
Thank you, Christina. It's been such a pleasure to spend this time with you. Well, we're at the end of our time today. I would like to thank everyone for tuning in. You've been listening to Moments with Marianne. And remember, make every moment count.
In a single moment, your life can change. Moments with Marianne is a transformative hour that covers an endless array of topics with the best of the best. Her guests are leaders in their fields, ranging from inspirational authors, top industry leaders, and business and spiritual entrepreneurs. Each guest is gifted and a true visionary, a recognized leader in her own work, and while teaching others to develop, refocus, and grow, Marianne will bring the best guest and sometimes a special surprise. Don't miss this. You never know just which moment will change your life forever. Moments with Marianne airs every Thursday, Friday, and Sunday at 8 p.m. Eastern, 6 p.m. Mountain Time. Make sure to tune in and visit momentswithmarianne.com for more information.